So if we go ahead and we measure GDP, here's one way of thinking about it. So the question is, are we 40 times better off than our grandparents? So if I go and look through the Australian Bureau of Statistics website and I dig up, or the RBA website I think this was from, Australian GDP in 1960, the Australian GDP in 1960 was about $15.6 billion. Australian GDP in 2000 was about $656 billion. The ratio of the two is 40. So the question then is, are you guys 40 times better off than your grandparents were? After all, your grandparents were the people living perhaps in the 1960s, and you here are living in the post-2000s. So 2 generations later, are people 40 times better? Looking at the GDP statistics like that, we'd say, well, yes, that's what the numbers tell us. So the thing is, we're forgetting a few things. So one thing we're forgetting is over time, Australia's population has risen. After all, in economics, we're not really interested in having lots of people. What we'd like to ensure is that in Australia, we have lots of people that are better off. So in Australia, we're not really interested in having more stuff if it means that there's a lot less stuff per person. Fundamentally, in economics, we're concerned about stuff per person. How much resources does your average Australian have available to them? That's what we're thinking about in macroeconomics, and that's what GDP is meant to measure. It's meant to measure what's the access of your average person in a country. So what we tend to do is we add up the value of all the stuff that's bought and sold in Australia in a year, and we divide that by the number of Australians. That, in a sense, is the average amount of stuff that Australians have. So the population in 1960 was about 10 million, and it was about 90 million in 2000. It's close to, or a bit above 22 million now. We simply divide it. We're going to say, what is the GDP per person? And that's what the Gapminder graph was looking at, right? It's GDP per person over time. So we're going to divide it by the number of people. So the average person in 1960 in Australia had access to $1,560 worth of stuff. The average person in 2000 had access to $34,500 worth of stuff. So again, the ratio of those two is suggesting that Australians are, about 10 times better off. 15 times better off in 2000 than in 1960. Is that true? Well, again, that's probably not true. We're missing something else as well. And that's the fact that prices in 1960 were a lot lower than prices in 2000. If you travel back in time with $1,000 in your pocket, and then you went and see what you could buy in 1960 with $1,000, you're going to come back with a lot more stuff than if you travel around nowadays with $1,000 in your pocket trying to buy something. Right? A lot of things that are available today wouldn't even been available in 1960. Right? There'd be no VCRs, there wouldn't be any answering machines, certainly no computers that you could purchase with $1,000. And so, there's also the change in prices. So we want to also adjust then for the change in prices over time. So this, again, is coming back to this idea of the real GDP versus nominal GDP. We want to measure how much stuff Australians have so that we can compare whether you're better off than your grandparents. So 2 generations of Australians is 1 generation 20 times, 10 times, 5 times, or what? How much better off is 1 generation of Australians compared to earlier generations? And so what we need to do then really is measure real GDP per person. And again, if you go back to the Gapminder graph, you'll see that's exactly what he's measuring there. Over time, you're tracking out real GDP per person in all of these different countries. So we have this concept called the GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator is a way of translating between one year and another. How much is $1,000 worth, in a sense, in 1960? If you took that same $1,000 worth of stuff in 1960, how much would it take in 2000 to buy that level of stuff? That's really what we're thinking about. So if we did this, we'd see that if we used real GDP calculations in 1960 and real GDP calculations in 2000, we get this result. That Australian GDP in 1960 was actually 138 billion. It wasn't 15.6. That's the difference in prices. Right? That $15.6 billion would buy you $138 billion worth of stuff in year 2000 prices, because the prices of things have risen so much. Right? Your average car in 1960 might have cost a couple of $1,000. That would be it. That would be the top-end car. In this case, again, if we divide, because we're interested in real GDP person, we're going to say that in 1960, the average Australian earned or had access to $13,800 worth of stuff. And in 2000, the average person had access to $33,200 worth of stuff. So now we're going to say, okay, if we adjust for population and we adjust for prices, then the average person is 2.5 times better off in 2000 than they were in 1960. And that's a pretty big amount. Right? We're saying that the average person today has 2.5 times more stuff. So there's some interesting ways that you can have a look at that. If you go and you watch an old black and white TV show, watch an old black and white TV show, it doesn't matter whether it's, something set in the 60s or the 50s, or maybe even Skippy in the 1970s. So go back and watch it. Don't watch the show, just watch the homes. Have a look at how much stuff people have. And what you'll be amazed by is the amount of crap people didn't have in the 1950s or 40s. The homes were bare. Right? Today's homes have 5 TVs. A house in the 60s might have 1. And that was a relatively wealthy person. A lot of other people would go over to their neighbor's place to watch TV. Right? They might have 1 couch. Their garage would be empty. Walk into a garage of any Australian today. Sometimes people can't even fit their cars in their garage because their garage is full of all their crap. That's where you keep your jet ski. And, your surfboards and your fishing rods and your tennis rackets that you used last year, blah, blah, blah. Right? Australians just have so much more crap nowadays than their grandparents ever did. Think 100 years ago. 100 years ago, there was a concept called the dowry chest. Any guys know what the dowry chest is? What was in the dowry chest? The dowry chest was everything the wife would bring into the wedding. So you put the wife on the cart, you put the dowry chest in the back, and whoosh, off she goes. The dowry chest might be as big as this table here. The dowry chest was everything that the future wife owned, including curtains, crockery, cutlery, bedding, towels. The lot would be in a little case like that. Now, how many carloads does it take for you guys to move out of your apartments? Right? How much more crap do you have than you would have had 100 or 200 years ago, or even in this case, 40 years ago? You guys have so much more stuff. And that's, in a sense, what we're measuring here. So the next question then is, you have 2.5 times more stuff than your grandparents. Are you 2.5 times more happy than your grandparents? If you ask your grandparents, would they say that they're 2.5 times more happy now than they were 50 years ago? My grandparents often tend to talk about the good old days, when they were 2.5 times poorer, it seems, and yet somehow we're happy. So there's a real discrepancy there.